Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 41. The mission of our Digging Deeper moments is to take God's Word to God's world, and so we're glad that you joined us. Tonight, we're going to continue working through the images of the book of Revelation. And if you haven't already downloaded the outline that we've provided for you, we would encourage you to do that now. You can find it on our website, YouTube, or Facebook. Now, we've been for some time together, in our time together, we've been in the book of Revelation, and we've seen that it is made up of four primary visions, which we have labeled acts, like the acts of a play. We've also seen that it records a heavenly worship service, and that worship service takes place in heaven. Worship begins in the first vision found in Revelation chapters 1 through 3 and moves to the middle and the end of the worship service in the second vision, which is found in Revelation 4, chapter 4 through 16. This brings us to the third vision, or act, found in Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 through 21, verse 8. It's really, this third vision is a tale of two cities. I like to call it the harlot city Babylon and the bride of Christ, which is the heavenly Jerusalem. These actually represent two cities. Now, before we get into the images used here in this vision, we must first see something very important. The third vision is actually an expansion of the end of the worship service which took place in Revelation chapter 14 through 16. Just as we saw earlier in our studies that the heavenly worship service that takes place in the second vision was interrupted 3 times during the worship service itself, something that you'll see that it's noted on your outline or playbill. We now see a fourth interruption at the end of the worship service. But because it's at the end, it's technically not an interruption, it's an extension of the end of the worship service. So if you think about it, the worship service ends in chapter 16, but now we get kind of like an add-on to give us a little bit more detail. Like the interruptions that we saw in the worship service, it gives us added detail that is not found previously in the text. This added detail talks about what happens to the city of Babylon in the end of the worship service found in chapter 14 through 16. Now, the connection between the second and third visions can be seen in at least 2 places. The first is found in Revelation 17:1, which says, let's read it together. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." When John talks about this angel that had the 7 bowls, he's talking about the 7 bowls of wrath, which took place in chapter 16 at the end of the worship service in chapter 16. If you remember, these are the 7 last plagues, and they are likened to the drink offering which took place in the worship service at the end of every service that took place in the Temple of Jerusalem. And so the 7 plagues are the drink offering, and he's connecting that vision of the end of the worship service with this current third vision by letting us know that the angel who had one of those bowls is actually speaking to him. The second connection is the city of Babylon itself. If we jump down to verse 5, it says, "And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth." If we go back to Revelation chapter 14, verse 8, the Bible tells us the following. It says, "And another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, the great city, because she has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." Now, as we look at these 2 references, chapter 14, verse 8, and the contents of chapter 17, when it speaks about this harlot, you'll see a lot of similarities. And these references, this reference and the first reference in verse 1, let us know that there's a connection between this third vision, which we're now looking at, and the former vision, which completed the heavenly worship service. Now, there are 8 primary images found in this third vision. And this vision runs from chapter 17, verse 1 to chapter 21, verse 8. And so we're going to now begin to look at the imagery of each of the 8 images as we go through. We'll cover a few of them tonight, and we'll cover the rest next week. But as we read Revelation chapter 17, we find the first primary image. And what John sees is he sees a woman, a harlot woman, riding a scarlet-colored beast. The woman and the beast are described in great detail. Now, this imagery speaks of the harlot city of Babylon who is riding a beast or kingdom to power. This imagery comes from a mixture of Old Testament scriptures and apocalyptic literature. The woman as a harlot is an Old Testament image used almost exclusively to speak of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament when they had turned away from God to worship idols. In fact, there are only two non-Israelite cities that the Bible refers to as harlots in the Old Testament. One is the city of Tyre, and the other is the city of Nineveh. Now, both had connections in the Old Testament with Israel. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 21 says this, "How the faithful city," speaking of Jerusalem, "has become a harlot. It was full of justice, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers." So you can see that the city in Isaiah was Jerusalem, and his city had been corrupted. And that's what this imagery is communicating, that this city Babylon, whoever it is corrupted. That's coming from the Old Testament. So you'll see all through the Old Testament, God's people were referred to when they went off in sin as harlotry. The apocalyptic imagery is seen in that the beast carries the woman. Beasts were used in apocalyptic literature to refer to kingdoms. And so we even see this in Daniel the prophet when he speaks of a couple of beasts in chapter 7 and 8 of the book of Daniel. And so this woman, we don't know who this woman is, or at least scholars debate, and they debate greatly on who they think this woman is. And the thing that we need to remember as we look at the identity of this woman is that who we think this woman is depends largely on our method of interpretation. In previous Digging Deeper moments together, we've talked about the four different ways people interpret the book of Revelation, which we call interpretive methods, or methods of interpretation. The four are these: futurist, preterist, historical, and spiritual methods. And each one of these four, which we've explained in other times together, so we're not going to repeat that, but each one of them has a different opinion on who this city is and what the kingdom that this beast represent is. And so it's very important to keep that in mind. And you read different books or hear different preachers on the subject, and you understand that who they think this woman is really like a tell on how they interpret the book. Now, it's not in the scope of the study to get into that kind of material. We may kind of visit that at another time as we circle back and do other sermons on the book of Revelation. The second primary image in this third vision is found in Revelation chapter 18. After seeing this woman who's riding a scarlet-colored beast, and this beast, by the way, has 10 horns and 7 heads, and so all that imagery has things that it speaks about and gives us detail, but we don't have time to go into that. Now, after moving from that image, John goes into another image, and in chapter 18, it's an image of an angelic herald. A herald is one that announced news in the Old Testament days and in old times. And so this herald, this angelic angel, this angel who is declaring a message, declares the fall and destruction of the city of Babylon. Now, this imagery is taken from the Old Testament books of Isaiah, chapters 13 and 14, which speaks of the fall of Babylon, and Jeremiah chapter 50, which also speaks of the fall of the actual city of ancient Babylon. But this imagery is also taken and largely taken from the book of Ezekiel chapter 27 and 28, which speaks of the fall of the city of Tyre. Tyre was a known enemy of Israel, and if you read Ezekiel, you'll find there's a lot of similarities between Ezekiel 27 and 28 and what Revelation 18 says. And so, Tyre, as we've seen, is one of those two cities in the Old Testament where the term harlot is actually used for a non-Jewish city. Now, there's a reason for that, and that is because the message that he's trying to convey here is that this city was a harlot city. It had been corrupted and turned its back on God. That's all we're going to say about it in this lesson. But the message of this vision is clear. In chapter 17 and 18, these images convey a very clear message, and that is this: whoever this city of Babylon is and whoever this beast is, they represent the enemies of God, and the message is that God's enemies and God's people's enemy will be destroyed, and they'll be destroyed completely. Now, that was good news for the church in the first century. It was good news for the first recipients of the letter of the book of Revelation, because they were being oppressed by a number of enemies, and God is assuring them through this imagery that their enemies are going to be dealt with. That would have been very good news for them. But as I've said before, it's bad news for God's people's enemies. The book of Revelation is often talked about in a very pessimistic way, as if it's bad news. People tend to focus on all the judgments and the things that take place, and they forget sometimes that the judgments revealed in Revelation are against the enemies of God. And so in that light, the book of Revelation really is good news. It's good news that someday God's people's enemies will be destroyed, that all that's wrong will be righted, and that God will put an end to wickedness in the earth. The book of Revelation is a lot of things, but these are the general messages, and these are the images that we find in these first 2 chapters of the third vision. So we've looked at chapter 17, and we've looked at chapter 18, and next week we'll begin to enter chapter 19 as we look at the other images found in this third vision of the book of Revelation, which really the overarching theme is there's 2 cities. Right now we're looking at one city called Babylon the harlot, and next week we'll begin to get into the bride of Christ, which is the heavenly Jerusalem. If you've enjoyed this lesson, please share it with a friend. We'll see you next week.